Olá, pessoal. Só avisando que a próxima palestra vai ser em inglês, com o Simon Wardley, que é um pesquisador, digamos assim. Ele fala sobre estratégias, mapas e assuntos do tipo. Vai ser bem interessante. É um assunto que eu sempre quis que mais CTOs do Brasil soubessem. So, to the stage right now, Simon. Ah, okay.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, hi. So I just introduced you to the audience saying that you are a kind of like a researcher, that you kind of talk about mapping and maps and strategy,
Yeah,
and it will
that's
be in
true.
English talking. That's
Yeah.
basically it, right?
Background, I've built and run companies and sold companies, and I got into something. I used to run strategy for interesting companies, and I'd done a lot of stuff with government, a bit of this and a bit of that sort of thing. And I use mapping as well. And mapping itself it seems to have spread. It's become more popular these days. I mean, I started off using mapping for my own activities, which included, running companies, M&As and things like that, investment strategy. And I sort of assumed everybody else in the world knew how to do this. And I'm sometimes a bit slow. It took me about 5 or 6 years to discover that nobody else seemed to be doing this. And I was quite shocked. And so I started 2005 to 2010, 11. I sort of worked out that nobody else seemed to be doing it. These days, it's taught at places like Harvard Kennedy, Peking University, London School of Economics. It's spread all over the place. So, yeah, and that's what I'm here to talk about, maps.
Nice.
By the way,
I'm gonna
thank you
leave
for
you to that.
inviting me. Absolute
Yeah.
delight. We just had a power strike, literally half an hour ago. The entire village I live in a tiny marsh hidden away. The rest of the village has no power at all. I have like huge batteries on the side of the house, solar power arrays on the top, UPSs, multiple different lines which I channel bond over. So if there is any
Whoa.
tapping on the window, it's because my neighbours have worked out they've got no power and I've still got all my lights on. Okay, so
It's
if
okay.
there's any
It's okay. It's okay.
interruption,
It's okay. Perfect. So I'm gonna leave you to that. That's very
okay.
curious because you're always talking about your power situation and so on Twitter. I never thought it would happen right on stage. So yeah, that's
Oh,
nice.
oh, oh, this is. I think I had about 14, 15 power cuts because I'm living in a marsh. There's lots of issues going on with power. This is over the last 2 years or so. I actually, unfortunately, happened right in the middle of a conference, but of course I didn't notice because I've got UPSs, batteries, and blah. I just powered on until somebody came tapping on my window, and it was just like. It happens. It's
What can I
life. It's the
do?
remote world we live in.
Okay.
Okay.
So thank you very much and take your
Pleasure.
time.
All right. No problem at all. Let me share a screen. Can you all see that, by the way? Should say crossing the river by feeling the stones. Yes, I can see lots of thumbs up. Oh, fantastic. Oh, I like these symbols. They're really, really very cute. I'm going to ask a question now. Have you done mapping before? If you've done mapping before, give us a little heart. If you haven't, give us a little clap. And that way I can sort of get an idea. Right, a couple of you, but most of you have not done mapping before. That's okay. All right, not a problem at all. Crossing the river by feeling the stones. First of all, a little plug. Mapping has grown. There's an entire online community of mappers now. I mean, last year we had a conference of 1,300 mappers all over the world, places like the UN, Amazon, all sorts of interesting companies and organizations. So we do a map camp once a year. It's all virtual. It's going on the 13th of October. And the next thing is all of this work is Creative Commons Share Alike by SA. So I made it Creative Commons, 16 years ago. So everything you see in mapping, just help yourself. You'll find I've got a book, medium.com/Wardley Maps, about 600 pages, easy to find. Just help yourself to that. There's, in fact, an entire community. There's a list.wardleymaps.com, an awesome list which links to all sorts of wonderful groups and forums. And so if you get into this, you can sort of dig in as your heart's content. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the origin of how I got into mapping. Then I'll talk about maps. Then I'll talk about patterns. And I sort of thought I'd pick a subject to end with, if I have time. I thought I'd pick the issue of digital sovereignty, because it just seems to be a topic that's coming up. There's many things we could talk about, organization and manipulation of markets, loads actually. But I thought I'd pick this one. Okay, so I'll start with the origin. So for me, this all started back in 2004, maybe 2003. I was working for this company, Fotango. Now, Fotango was an online photo service. It had about 16 different lines of business. This included, things like a single sign-on service and a CRM service for others, and had its photo service. Revenue was rapidly growing, very profitable. It had millions and millions of users, but it had a problem. And that problem was the CEO. The CEO of the company was completely and utterly clueless. They didn't know what they were doing. They were making it up as they went along. Now, I know this because I was the CEO of the company. I used to come up with these wonderful statements about our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. But literally, I pinched this from other companies and just changed a few words. We were heavy adopters of extreme programming. A friend of mine's Kent Beck, who wrote some extreme programming, just in case. It's an agile method, in case you didn't know. And we were heavy providers, supporters of open source. Most of the Perl pumpkins actually worked for me. We were heavy supporters of Perl. But anyway, all of my sort of vision statements were basically cobbled together, common words. I'd hear people say this. There was no substance to it. But still, nonetheless, we were growing. Revenue going up, profitability, so nobody really noticed that I didn't know what I was doing. But I was getting a bit sort of desperate, being this fake CEO, and I used to read every book I could find on strategy. I was getting nowhere, and I went into a particular bookshop in London, and I talked to the bookseller about my problem with strategy, and she suggested to me that I should buy 2 copies of The Art of War, 2 different translations, because they're all translations and they're all slightly different. And I'm so grateful for that, because it was in the reading of the second one, I noticed there was a particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. 1, have a purpose, a moral imperative, i.e. what you're trying to do. 2nd, understand the landscape you're competing in. 3, understand the climatic patterns or the heavens, i.e. how the landscape is changing. 4, understand doctrine. So these are universal principles of organization. And finally, you get into the leadership bit and the gameplay. And I was sort of like, well, that sort of made sense to me. And then I came across John Boyd. So John Boyd, a US Air Force pilot, the Mad Major, came up with something called the OODA loop. So you have the game that you're playing. You observe the environment. That's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. It's about observing the environment and how it's changing. And then you orientate around this. And that's what principles or guiding principles or doctrine. Doctrine just means a collection of guiding principles. That's what that's about, orientating yourself around a space. And then you need to decide where you're going to attack, and then you act. And it's a loop. And in the heart of this are 2 whys. The first why is the why of purpose. So if I'm playing a game of chess, my why of purpose may be to win the game. Might not be, but it might be. And then you've got the why of movement. So do I move this piece or that piece? And of course, as you move, it changes the board, it changes the context, etc. And so, you learn patterns as you play the game. Climatic patterns are the rules of the game. I mean, you learn different forms of gameplay, leadership as well. All right. So at the heart of this was this concept of landscape. So I really got into military history and I was fascinated by military maps and battles of the past. So this is the Battle of Thermopylae. So Themistocles, ancient politician, Greek general, had a problem. The Persians were invading. There are about 140,000 Persians. What they decided to do was block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. Now, the Greeks were independent city-states. The army was about 4,000 Greeks in total, including 300 Spartans, and that's where we get the story of the 300 from. And I was looking at this map and thinking, isn't it marvelous? I can see where things are. We can talk about how to move troops and all the rest of it. And I thought, well, how do I do this in business? And the way I made decisions was with something called a SWOT diagram. So I thought, I'm going to write the SWOT diagram for this battle. See what happens. So strengths: a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses: the ephors might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities: get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're Athenian. Themistocles was Athenian. We actually hate the Spartans, so that would be a bonus if we get rid of them. Threats: the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced in a few thousand years. So I simply put these next to each other and ask myself, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Would I use position and movement on a map, or would I use some sort of magic framework like a SWOT? And I thought, well, come on, it's obvious. I would use a map. So then I asked myself, well, what am I using in my business? And what I was using was the SWOT. So I thought, right, I need some form of map. And so that got me into the whole subject of maps within business. So the first thing I did was said, right, I want to see all our maps. And people brought me loads of maps. We had business process maps. We had mind maps. We had things like this. It's a system map. And so I looked at this system map and I thought, great. All right. Well, what happens if I move a piece? So I've got customers, photo storage, website, runtime, compute. It's for the online photo storage. I've got CRM. So I'm going to move that over here. How's the map changed? I'll do that again. I'll go back. It was there. I've moved it there. And the answer is it hasn't. I thought, well, that's a bit odd, because if I take a map of the world and I take, say, Australia and move it next to the UK, that has definitely changed. So why hasn't this changed? And the reason why it hasn't changed is it's not a map. It's a graph. And unfortunately, everything I had which was called a map, business process maps, mind maps, all of them, weren't actually maps. They were all graphs. So explain the difference. The three images at the top are all identical graphs. They're three places in the UK, Nottingham, London, Dover, connected by 2 roads. And those 3 at the top are all identical. Now, the 3 images at the bottom are all maps, and they're completely different. Now, the difference between a map and a graph is that in a graph, space has no meaning, and in a map, space has meaning. I.e., when you move a piece, one way or another, it changes the actual context. So when I look at something like a mind map and I take a piece and I move it slightly, it doesn't change context. That's because it's actually a mind graph. So I thought, right, I need some maps. So what are the key characteristics of a map? Well, if I look at a map, it's got an anchor, so magnetic north. It's got position of pieces relative to each other. This is north, south, east, or west of this. And you have an idea called consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I'm going south. So pretty straightforward. So I needed to recreate that in business. How do I do that? I hadn't got a clue. No idea. So I sat there and thought, right, well, I like cups of tea, so I'll do a tea shop. And I thought, well, what's the anchor going to be? And I said, well, okay, I'm a member of the public. I like consuming tea, and there's the business. So I'm going to put those as the anchor, the business and the public at the top. They're the anchor. I could also have government regulators or others. Now, the public, they need a cup of tea. Well, we hope they need a cup of tea. And the business, they need to sell cups of tea. So they both have a need, which is the cup of tea. Now, a cup of tea has needs. It needs tea. It needs a cup. It needs hot water. And hot water needs cold water. It needs a kettle. And kettle needs power. So what I've got is a chain of needs. So I've got anchor at the top, chain of needs. And the further I go down the chain of needs, the less visible, the more distant it seems. So, for example, if I'm a member of the public, I have my cup of tea, I don't care a great deal about the power that actually went into making that cup of tea. I don't even think about it. Of course, if I'm producing the cup of tea, I have to be concerned with the whole thing. I may not be concerned with how the power is generated. That's even further down, but I need to be concerned that we've got power for our kettle. Okay, that's anchor and position. It doesn't give me movement. Turns out all of these things are forms of capital. And there are 4 common stages by which capital seems to evolve. You start off with the genesis of the novel anew, then you get custom-built examples, then you get products and rental services, then you get commodity and utility services. This really should say stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's not very meaningful. That's why I put those labels in there. But it's not just physical activities that evolve, but also data, also practices, knowledge, even ethical values. And we just, you can either, there are different labels that you can use, but they all have the same characteristic. So what I can do is I can simply take my value chain and say, how evolved are these components? And I create a map, because now what I've got is anchor, position, and movement described through evolution. And if I simply move a piece on this map, left or right, it actually changes meaning. So space has meaning. It's an actual map. Now somebody can look at this and go, oh, because what I'm doing is I'm exposing my assumptions here to how to build something. They can go, you're missing staff. And somebody will go, oh no, staff are more commodity-like, industrialized, you need robots. Okay, we can have a discussion on that. Somebody else might go, these are lines of capital flow, these are stocks of capital, we can put metrics to this. Out of that, you can create things like P&Ls. Somebody might challenge what we're doing. They might go, oh, kettle, why are we custom building kettles? Surely we should be using standard kettles. Somebody else might go brand exclusivity, whatever. The point about this is it doesn't matter whether you're from finance or engineering or the business side or marketing or operations. We can all talk about the same environment using a map. So it's a common language. Okay, so let me give you an example of use. This is an insurance company. This is back in 2010, 2011. They had a problem. When they needed compute, they would order server would go into goods in, they would modify, mount, and rack it, and there was a bottleneck with the modification and mounting of servers. So there was a bottleneck in their process flow. They were growing. They put a plan together to invest in robotics. They'd spent 6 months working on this. It was about 10 million, or well, it was just under that. Market capital investment, and they were going to spend this money to get rid of this bottleneck. And they're a pretty big company, actually. They had all the business case, return on investment calculations, all that sort of stuff. Now, you can't go in there and say, well, they asked me to have a look and see what I thought, but I couldn't go in and say, why are you using robots? The reason for that is it would become highly political if I did. Like most organizations, we're often driven by stories. Unfortunately, we have an entire industry out there which tells people that to be good leaders, you have to be a great storyteller. And that means that when you challenge somebody's story, like why are you using robots, you're actually saying you're not a great leader. And we are told continuously our ideas didn't succeed because we didn't sell the story in the right way. So literally, when you challenge a story, you are challenging the person. So I can't go in there and say, why are you doing robots? Because they would just get very defensive. Here's all the business case. Here's the ROI, etc. So I asked them, could you just quickly map this for me? A lot of resistance. but they spent 15 minutes. And they went, user needs compute. I remember this 2011. Put computing product. I would argue it was a commodity even then. Order server, very commodity-like. Server, commodity-like. Can't quite understand why computing product and server in commodity, but okay. They had goods in, very commodity. And they went rack, mount, modify. And I was able to look at that map and just ask a question. Why have you got rack and custom built? And they went, well, we have our own custom-built racks. We have this company who makes our racks for us. Okay. So what are the modifications you're making to servers? Well, the servers don't fit our racks. That's why we need to take cases off them, drill new holes, add new plates in order to fit our racks. And that's why you need robotics. Yes. Now, I didn't have to say anything. Somebody immediately in the rooms went, why aren't we using standard racks? Now, this is probably the most common problem I see. These people were not daft. They were very, very smart, but they were trapped by the stories of the past around them. At some point, custom-built racks made sense. By simply being able to, step back and draw a map, they were able to challenge their own assumptions. And I see this all the time. People optimizing process flow, in which case you would spend the money on robotics, when in fact what they should be doing is optimizing evolutionary flow. You shouldn't be optimizing this process. You certainly shouldn't be spending money on robotics. You should be shifting rack from basically being a custom built to more of a commodity. And a very simple example, if a user needs a slice of toast, what do? Buy a toaster for $40, or do you spend 9 months lovingly creating a toaster for $1,000 from raw materials, which is what Thomas Thwaite did in the toaster project. First time he switched it on, that's what it looks like. It burst into flames, but he built it from raw ingredients. Well, of course, what you do is you buy the commodity. If the user needs some compute, what do? Use a compute utility like EC2 or Azure, or do you spend years and millions of dollars lovingly building your own, I don't know, OpenStack or Kubernetes or whatever from raw materials? It's a pretty simple answer. So I'll give you another example now, which is a heavy engineering project called HS2, High Speed Rail. So it's trains. I happen to like trains. This is James Finley, good friend of mine. He's the CIO was the CIO, he's now moved on to do other things of HS2. This was back in 2012, roughly. So they decided to build high-speed rail, first of all, in a virtual world. And the reason for this is pretty simple. It's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we've got that wrong, than it is to dig up the English countryside. If you do that and get it wrong, it's very expensive. So they decided to build it all in a virtual world. So they had to build a system. And this was their systems graph for building it. Lots of different components. Now, James's problem was, how do we manage this? Which bit should we outsource? Which bits should we build with off-the-shelf products? Maybe some of the stuff should be built in-house in agile techniques. Well, that simple diagram, those three questions, there's about 387 million possible permutations. So how do you know which one to do? Difficult. So in government, what we used to do was this. Let's outsource the lot. And what we do is we'll break it into sensible sounding contracts. So we'll have one contract called engineering, which will have engineering sounding things in that contract. Things like graphical information system, project information system, we'll put that in engineering. And then we'll have like another contract for the user experience, where we'll put things like collaboration tools, maybe a portal, maybe we'll put those things over there. And then we'll have another contract, say, for back office, finance and things, risk management. We'll put that in there. Another one for infrastructure. And then we'd outsource it. And generally, it would be a complete failure for various reasons. So James decided to do something different. He decided he would map it out. So that's the map he created. It was on a Sunday afternoon. It took him a couple of hours while having a cup of tea. He sent it to me, and I slightly updated the map. And he said, how do you manage this? Well, I knew the answer because I'd previously experienced this. What I'd previously discovered is we'd gone extreme programming everywhere back in 2003. Pretty quickly, we discovered it didn't work everywhere. And the reason for this is as things evolve, their characteristics change. They start off in this uncharted space where they're chaotic, uncertain, unpredictable. Eventually, they end up on the right-hand side, the commodity. They're very industrialized, ordered, standard, repeatable. And so what happens is you need different methods. So extreme programming is very good on the left-hand side because it reduces the cost of change and changes the norm. Whereas lean, so things like Scrum, MVP, are good in the middle because they're about learning and reducing waste. And things like Six Sigma, outsourcing, works on the right because it's all about reducing deviation. And deviation is not what you want. So you just simply apply that. You go, we outsource the stuff on the right, off-the-shelf products in the middle, build it, agile, in-house techniques on the left. And of course, we also know that as things, over time, things will evolve. So the methods we will use will change as that evolves. So that's what they did. And the project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee because it was way ahead of schedule, way under budget, which is like pretty much unheard of in government projects. Now, normally, we'd gone and outsourced this whole lot. So let's pretend we outsource the whole lot, and we'll look at one lot, engineering. All right, let's overlay that on the map. So there's lot one, engineering. There's the components, and we've decided to outsource this under some sort of contract to some supplier. I can tell you before we've started, this will fail. And the reason why is some parts on the right will be efficiently treated because we can define them, because they're more commodity, well understood, well defined. We can put them in a contract, but the stuff on the left will constantly change. So we will always incur excessive change control costs if we try and put them in some sort of contract, because we really don't know what we want. And so we'll always end up with a fight with the vendor, and they can always point to us, it was our problem because we kept on changing our mind. Well, we wouldn't know. There was no way of us actually knowing because these things are more towards the uncharted space. So I suppose that's the third most common thing. The first thing is the sort of evolutionary flow, process flow, people trying to optimize things. And I see huge, total billions wasted, people doing that sort of stuff. The second thing is that misapplication of methods. We're going to try and do agile everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere. That doesn't work. And the third is that most of the contract structures, when you actually map them and overlay the contracts, they're generally flawed. So this is the sort of stuff we did in UK government. I wrote something called the Better for Less paper with this chap named Maxwell and several others. This was back in 2010, led to the creation of spend control, helped support something called GDS, Government Digital Services. Literally one project alone, just by simply mapping it out, saved about 425 million, about 1.5 billion in its lifetime. Now, remember, the people doing the project aren't daft. It's just difficult to make decisions if you can't see the landscape. It's like being a general, and you can't see the landscape. Well, what do? You just go, oh, let's bomb a hill. Find a tree and bomb a tree, or whatever, because you can't see where you're competing. All right, so let's talk about patterns. The first sort of patterns you come across are what are known as climactic patterns. There's about 30 of those, and they're really useful for anticipation of change, investment plays, but we don't have time to go through them all. I'll go through a subset. So I'm going to use a map for this. We start off with a user, requires an application, requires best coding practice, requires a runtime operating system, best architectural practice, built on compute. This is roughly compute in 2006. Remember, it's not just physical activities that evolve, but also practices. The labels we normally use are novel, emerging, good, and best, but I've just written on them best. Okay. So the first pattern you learn is everything evolves. Your map is not static. If there's supply and demand competition, things will move from the left to the right. So back in early 2006, we all knew that compute would eventually end up a utility. The second pattern you learn is that we have inertia to change. We have that inertia to change from past success. So it could be pre-existing financial capital, pre-existing governance and practices, pre-existing political capital. It's about 16 different forms of inertia to change. The next pattern you learn is you get coevolution. So as things evolve, their characteristics change. And as a result, you often get coevolution of practice with the physical activity. So, for example, best architectural practice for compute as a product was things like ITIL. When compute became a utility, then we got a new set of emerging architectural practices. Eventually, we got a name, Andy and Patrick called it DevOps. So we go from things like scale up and N+1 to distributed systems and design for failure. We could do continuous deployment in the old world, but you're waiting months for a machine to turn up. I mean, in the new world, you can get utility, you can get machines in seconds, so you get continuous deployment, all that sort of stuff. The next pattern you learn is efficiency enables innovation. So as things evolve, you get higher order systems. So as you get bricks, you get more complex buildings, cloud and things. We've got things like Netflix. And the next, Netflix online, I should say. The next thing we learn is that those higher order systems create new sources of value or worth. So what we can do is we can take a map, we can apply some basic patterns, and we can use that to work out where should we attack. So back in 2008, you would go, right, you want to make sure we're operating on cloud, we're focused on whatever these emerging practices are, focusing on the new things building on top. We may want to differentiate with higher order systems, but we want to get out of those best architectural practice based on compute as a product, i.e. servers and data centers. And that's exactly what I did with Ubuntu. So we used the map to target the space. Ubuntu is an operating system. We were about 2 to 3% of the operating system market against Microsoft and Red Hat. We're a total minnow. So we used the map. It cost me, I think we spent $500,000. It took us 18 months. And we went from 2 to 3% to 70% of all cloud computing. And of course, once we hold that position, you wait for the rest of the market to catch up with you, because we knew we just had to dominate that space, and eventually everybody else would be joining us in the cloud. Of course, those practices didn't stand still. They continue to evolve. Andy and Patrick gave it a name. They called it DevOps. And then around 2014, the runtime started to shift from product to utility. We got systems like AWS Lambda. And of course, that's causing co-evolution of practice. So you're getting a new emerging practice. It's finally got a name. It's called FinOps. And you're getting new needs built on top of it. And every time we go through this, you get those benefits of efficiency from the more commodity form, but you get the speed from its provision and also the new emerging practice, and of course, new sources of value and worth. And the point about this is that 2008, you attack one place. 2015, your strategy should have changed. Your strategy should be iterative. So you should be focused on these areas. 2016, 2017, that's definitely where you should be. The stuff at the bottom is now, this combination of your legacy and your new legacy. So like cloud and DevOps, that's that's going to become your new legacy. If you were starting off on a journey, if you're one of those companies going, we're going cloud and DevOps today, well, Netflix took 7 years to get rid of, I talked to Adrian Maslin, it took 7 years to get rid of their data centers. So let's assume you're as fast as Netflix, which most people aren't, and you've got loads of data centers. It'll probably take you about 7 years to get rid of it if you were just starting a cloud infrastructure and DevOps journey today. By which time serverless will have become the new norm anyway, so you've just built yourself a new legacy. So you may as well be like Liberty Mutual, it's an insurance company, is just move up the stack and attack that space. My favorite example of this is people like iRobot, Ben Kehoe, always worth speaking to. Fantastic. They've got millions. I think it's about 10 to 15 million robots out there. It all runs on 100 Lambda functions, 30 AWS services. There's no EC2 instances. There's no containers. There's certainly no servers, no data center, or any of that sort of stuff. The entire operation is run by 6 people. Their entire monthly budget is like about the same as some companies spend on pencils. I mean, it's not a great deal, shall we say. So climactic patterns, that's all about anticipation of change. Where should you attack? Then you get into doctrine. So there's 30 climactic patterns. There's about 40 universally useful patterns of doctrine that have come out of mapping. So these are like basic rules that you should always use. Things like focusing on user needs. It's a basically universal principle. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It's a good idea to understand the user and understand their needs. And you have to do that with mapping. Another one is having a common language. So it's a good idea that everybody, regardless of their skill set, can talk about the same space. Another one is to challenge assumptions. That requires a whole bunch of things about psychological safety and other things as well, which are all extremely important, but critical. One of the beauties about maps is they're also imperfect representations of a space. So a perfect map of France would be 1-to-1 scale, which means it would be the size of France. And as a map, that would be useless. So all maps have to be imperfect representations. And because they're imperfect representations, there's no such thing as the right map, which encourages people to challenge assumptions. So ideally, you take somebody's story, which is difficult to challenge without challenging the person. You get into a mapping form, and it now becomes much easier to say, you're not saying, I think you're wrong. You're saying, I think the map is wrong. And people can go, well, maps are always wrong. And then we discuss the issue. So it enables us to challenge assumptions. Next principle is use appropriate methods. There's about 40 of those. This is all Creative Commons. You can go look online. There's a big table called the Doctrine Table with a collection of about 40 of those. They all seem to be universally useful. Then you get into leadership. Leadership is where we get into things like gameplay. There's about 100 different forms of gameplay, ways of changing the market. We certainly don't have time to go through those. I'll just give a few, I'll give two examples. One is called the ILC model. So I read about this in 2005. You can find it. AWS published its second ever book, which is called Reaching Cloud Velocity. And in that book, it's the second ever book they've created. They've got about 17, 18 pages of mapping and things they use mapping for, my form of mapping. And in there is a particular model, which I wrote long ago, which is this model, the ILC model. So works very simply. You take a product, you turn it into a utility, provide it as a component service to others, so expose it through an API. If you're going to build something with APIs and provide to others, always try and build a commodity. If you try and build it when it's still in the early stages of its evolution, it creates all sorts of problems because if you provide it to others, it's going to be constantly changing all the time. So try and focus on finding things which are really quite widespread and turn those into commodity. Like compute, turn that into a commodity with compute utility. And then you get componentization effects, Herbert Simon's theory of hierarchy. So other people can more rapidly build novel and new things on top. Now, a lot of people will build useless things like, I don't know, kitten internet. Some of them might come up with useful things like, I don't know, big data. Now, their data is their data. You can't touch that. But you have to build them for the use of your system. So you have the consumption data. And that's metadata. And that's very useful because then you can see all the people who aren't growing and all the people who are growing. So what you can do is you can find the patterns which matter. So you might go, oh, look, the big data people are all growing, and you'll come up with a new service. We'll call it, say, Elastic Map Reduce. And then what will happen is everybody will cheer because you've now given them compute as a utility and Elastic Map Reduce as a utility, and they can more quickly build things, except for the people you've just harvested, in which case they'll go, you've eaten my business model, grumble, grumble. Okay, it's a very simple model. You basically get everybody else to innovate for you. You mine the metadata to spot future patterns, and you commoditize to component services. And now, if you think of this as your ecosystem, people building on top, building new things, then your apparent rate of innovation depends upon your size of your ecosystem, number of people building on top. Your customer focus, you're mining metadata to give people what they want, depends upon the size of the ecosystem, and efficiency is economies of scale. So that's size of the ecosystem. So all three of these will rapidly increase with the size of the ecosystem, and you'll just become more apparently innovative, customer focused, and efficient all the time. And the bigger you get, the more you are of these. Now, this is actually, from a nation state competition point of view, a brilliant thing. Because normally what happens in the market is people build products and they sit on it and rent extract for far too long. So it's great to have somebody come along and industrialize their space. Because in order to survive, they have to adapt. And it's Amazon's got it in books, so you know the game they play. It's quite easy for people to survive on top, like Netflix do, as long as you've got lots of good principles, doctrine in place. Because that's actually linked to adaptability. Anyway, so this is the game, compute. I usually use the circular symbol to point that particular gameplay. Amazon's done this with compute, machine learning engines. You just move up the stack. China government does the same as well. Fantastically good job at doing it. Tears up industry after industry as well. Anyway, you can read about that in that book, Reaching Cloud Velocity. Other approaches, I said there's over 100. Another would be use of open approaches, open methods, open source, open data, open APIs. Great way of shifting a market from left to right, to heading it towards more industrialized. Doesn't make much difference in terms of the genesis of novel and new. Doesn't matter whether it's open source or proprietary. Doesn't really impact that. Makes a big difference in terms of industrialization. We often get confused, though, because we use a dreadful word, innovation. And I say dreadful because the genesis of novel and new is called an innovation. Every feature differentiation we call an innovation. Every product to a utility business model is an innovation. So all you see at the bottom is innovation, innovation, innovation. So it makes no sense at all. And so people say, well, open source helps innovation. Well, if you're talking about genesis, no. If it talks about industrialization, yes. Oh, it's the same with disruption theory. Christensen, Lepore, big arguments about disruption theory. The problem is, Christensen saying disruption theory is predictable, Lepore saying, giving examples, no, it's not. Well, the issue, if I just go back to this, is there are actually two different forms. The shift from product to utility is highly disruptive for pre-existing industries. We can anticipate that change. We know we're going to have inertia to the change. We know it's going to cause a change of practice, enable higher order. There's a lot we can say. So something like compute product to cloud like AWS, we know that's going to be disruptive. It's highly predictable. But product substitution, that can also be disruptive. Nokia versus Apple. But we have it's not predictable. We have no way of knowing which way it's going to go, which is why Christensen actually said that that Apple wouldn't succeed against Nokia. And in fact, they did. It's not because he was wrong or daft. It's because it's just unpredictable. And so that's the problem with disruption. There's two different forms. And again, if you don't map, there's no way you can see it. So I've talked about the origin, how I got into maps, and then talked about what a map is. And then I got into some basic patterns. Remember, maps are an imperfect representation of the landscape, but they allow us to communicate, to challenge an environment. We use them in government, save huge amounts of money in different areas. This particular project alone is 400. Well, it's way over there. It's heading towards the 1.5 billion mark. I prefer not the money examples, but these examples. This was the improvement of communication mechanisms within the lifeboat industry that saves hundreds of lives a year. This was James Finley. This was done with mapping, helped direct this stuff. My other favorite examples are things like using maps to combat illegal fishing. It's also used, maps have been used to combat things like slavery. I've done a whole bunch of stuff with my friends of mine building the UN Global Platform. UN Global Data Platform is this wonderful book here, which is all about reducing global poverty is the mission, and uses a whole bunch of maps in there to describe going from the mission of reducing global poverty all the way down through things like all-weather roads to national statistics organizations, to the underlying survey systems. So lots of cool stuff in there. That's quite cool. NASA's Constellation Carbon Mapper satellite system. It was built using maps, as in my maps. It maps itself in terms of other things, but it was actually built using my maps. And there's lots of books out there, including science fiction books like The Puncher's Scroll, which is basically the new, what described as the new Ready Player One. This is a science fiction book, but Tal Klein, the author, used a map to map one of my maps to map the future, and then wrote the science fiction book around that. I start off with Crossing the River by Feeling the Stones. It's a quote from Deng Xiaoping, famous Chinese economist and leader. The phrase basically means, understand your direction, take small steps, and learn about the environment as you go. And that's one of the things that we miss a lot within business is we don't map, to put it bluntly. Anyway, you can learn more about MapCamp and this stuff at MapCamp. By the way, just search MapCamp 2021, you'll find it. I suppose I can go on to sovereignty, but depends. Do you have questions?
So let me jump in before I have questions, because I know it's a lot, and I've been talking about I've been reading about maps for a lot of time. Let me share my screen for just 1 second so you can see one thing that I suffered, and I would like to see what would be your recommendation for other CTOs here reading about it. So let me see. You're seeing Twitter, and there's a tweet from Simon saying people take 7 years to start mapping because it takes 6 years speaking about it. Yeah. So I did that. I learned about maps in about 2013, 2014, and I did it for the first time in 2020.
And by the way, this is perfectly normal. I sat, I work with all sorts of government agencies, and I one particular government agency which deals with sort of defense and security stuff. It was like we talked about mapping, and I taught a bunch of people about mapping a long time ago, and it was like, that's really interesting, but they didn't use it. And then a crisis happened. And then somebody went, if only we'd mapped this beforehand, we would have seen this, because they drew the map. And so I came back and did some more teaching on mapping. And then, of course, they got sidetracked by the day jobs and everything else. And then sometime later, another crisis. And somebody went, if only we'd mapped this beforehand, we would have seen this. And this continued. And it literally was about 6 or 7 years till somebody went, that's it, right, we've got to start mapping. So when I tend to use mapping, I do what we call pre-mortem, post-mortem. So I tend to, people want to do something. I say, well, the first thing we're going to do is draw a map of what you're going to do, because I want to make sure you've thought about the users, you think about the user needs, you understand the details, what's in the supply chain, you understand how evolved the components, you draw it out, I can see your assumptions, and I'll challenge your assumptions. And then we'll have that discussion to get a common idea, agreement, and then go off and do the project. And then after the project, we'll come back and we'll do a post-mortem on the project, but we'll use the original map. So we can go back and say, this is what we thought. What's actually happened? Because one of the things I found was that people would write business cases for things. And, then we'd say we'd do a post-mortem on it. But those business cases had context, which we were completely missing because we didn't have the maps of the environment. And so generally what would happen is we'd write a business case, it would go on a wall after in a sort of archive after it had been agreed. It was never looked at again. And most sort of post-mortems they rarely ever happened. But now it's almost religiously pre-mortem, post-mortem, and use the maps as a learning vehicle. But yes, I'm afraid it takes, because it's a big jump, you're saying to people, you're making decisions without looking at the environment. It's like saying to a general, you're fighting battles, but you don't understand the landscape. So you're just you're telling your troops, go bomb a hill, find a tree, let's go attack a tree. And in fact, there's a battle going on, and you just you're just unaware that there is a landscape. And, it makes people go, of course, that's not true. I mean, I spent 6 years thinking, oh, that can't be true. They must teach this at MBAs. And then I discovered, no, they don't. And so now they teach it at places like Peking, LSE, Harvard Kennedy, and things like that. The brutal reality is people don't look at the landscape.
My question was, is there a way to maybe reduce, at least from 6 to like 3 years, maybe for people to start getting this working? Because I know I passed through it, but how could we like make people start using maps faster?
Okay, so let's be clear. When you decide to start, how long did it take before you started to find value out of it?
After I started really, really using.
Yes. How quickly did it start?
Instantly.
Almost instantly. Okay, so once you start, and it doesn't take long to learn how to do it, you start almost instantly getting value. The question is, how do we get people over the jump from thinking, that's a nice idea, to actually starting? And as I say, it normally takes them about 6 years of having been exposed to the idea, going, I must do this, I must do this, I must do this, until eventually they get so frustrated, they say, all right, I'm going to do this, because it seems like a really frightening thing to do, because you're having to put your assumptions down and you're having to ask people to challenge your assumptions and etc. And it also means people start to challenge you and question, and those are big sort of frightening steps. I don't know how to make that faster, other than, some people go, they read it. Often people with a military background or sailors or things like that, they read it and go, oh gosh, situational awareness, that really matters. And they just start instantly and usually pretty quickly find value. I've had projects where people have completely started to change the direction of their company within a few hours because they just find things that go, why are we doing this? But if you've not got that sort of background, you don't understand why situational awareness matters, you don't understand why understand the landscape matters, you've been drummed into you that, stories is the important thing. And you think you're doing well. I mean, yeah, it can take sometimes a long time for those people to, because it also is a big admission, I was sitting there with a person who was running a large company, and we started mapping, and it ended up changing the strategy of the company. And the thing is, they were saying they'd been doing strategy for 20, 30 years, and they'd never done it this way. And the realization I think they got to at the end is they hadn't been doing strategy. They'd been doing guesswork. They'd been fighting in the dark. And so that's a big hit to somebody. It's not easy. So I totally understand why it takes a long time.
Okay. And so there is one question that is, yes, almost all maps had the same lanes, the axis from Genesis to being a commodity. What kind of stuff would be right to be on the Genesis area? And I know it would be important to be on top or bottom, so it would be nice if you could expand on that.
Okay, so there is a table called the cheat sheet, because all of this stuff comes from text analysis that I did, about 9,223 documents. Not that number is burnt in my mind and the pain that I had to go through. And so there's a long list of characteristics for each of those. So Genesis really is about the completely novel and new. Not invented before concepts. So undefined market, high rates of failure, it's completely uncertain, it's constantly changing. So if you were talking about, somebody said, what's Genesis at the moment? Self-driving cars. Well, self-driving cars aren't Genesis, they're in the product stage already. The concept of the automotive is very much heading towards commodity. Intelligent agents are in that product stage heading towards commodity. Genesis would be things like teleportation. That's in the Genesis. Things which are genuinely novel and new. Most things we see are either emerging, or they're in the so that's the custom build stage, or they're in the product stage. And we get lots of feature differentiation on products, and people say, oh, my product's got a more innovative thing than your product. That's just differentiation between products.
Okay, nice. I don't think there are more questions right now, people that already asked it. And I just have a question. You said about going a little bit deeper. How many minutes would you need to go a little bit deeper on the...
If I go into the sovereignty thing, that'll probably take 15, 20 minutes. And so I know you're on a schedule.
Actually, it would depend on the next speaker. The next speaker is right here right now, but the next speaker would be a nice, chill conversation about how he deals with his problems as being CTO of a company with 300 plus developers. Okay. And so I just asked him.
Well, before you do that, I better explain. The next bit is about sovereignty. So it's nation-state competition level stuff. So it doesn't really time with your next speaker. It might be. I think it's good to. I hate to overrun. So that's why I put it as an optional. But you can have all the slides, and I'm always happy to chat if people want to know. And in there is an example of how you go about mapping cultural systems as well, because it's not just physical things, but practices, data, knowledge, ethical values. Culture is a whole new world of a whole area, shall we say, that can be mapped as well.
Okay. So first of all the content that you said, you send some links and so on, I'll be sending to the people interested on it later on. And if you have like any recommendations and closing words, it's up to you.
I do. My closing words are these. How have you found mapping? Because, I created mapping and I use it. And I find it, I wouldn't waste my time telling other people that I find mapping useful. And because I do. So that's obvious. So I suppose my closing words would be to you. How have you found mapping?
Okay. The closing words are a question. That's nice.
Yeah, to you.
I actually was at InfoKey conference in San Francisco a while ago, and you were on stage speaking about how people were wasting money on servers when we should be looking at serverless years ago. And serverless was not a thing yet. And I remember my friends that were like super specialists, they were working at Canonical and they were saying things like, no, it's better to do your own machine as a service and so on. I was like, let me hear this. And after 3 or 4 years, I saw how much serverless grew. And I was like, okay, there's something here that I should be studying. And I started studying it more. That's how I started on it.
But how has it impacted you? Has it impacted you at all? Has it changed?
It has. I never considered myself as I did not tend to see myself as a business person because I always found myself as a programmer. I'm a guy who makes code. And after I started mapping stuff, I was like, I can be much more pragmatic and sometimes not even code and deliver value. And I started to feel more pragmatic. And that's why I find it so fascinating, because I thought to be a business person, I had to have some kind of knowledge. And I was like, actually not. I just have to see what really there is to be done. And that's all.
So one of the things I do like most about mapping is it forces people to put their assumptions down. And it doesn't matter what background they come from. In a way that others can look at it and challenge those assumptions without challenging the person by saying the map is wrong. And that's that's almost always where we get the major changes come from. Because, of course, if it's you challenge the story, you're challenging the person. So we want to take the politics out of it and get everybody talking about the actual environment. And it's amazing. You can have a CEO of a huge company in a room with somebody who's an engineer and a developer, and the developer is pointing out flaws with the entire business model that we've got on the map. And it's just, if they were doing it in story form, they'd just get shut down. But because it's on a map, we can have the argument on that, away from the story, away from the politics and the hierarchy of the people. And that's what really has helped change things. Now, I know I'm out of time. I hate to overrun. It has been a delight. Thank you so much for asking me to come along. I hope that was all right. And I would just say thank you to to everyone.
Thank you, and see you soon. Bye bye.
Bye.